Buongiorno. Guten Tag. And welcome to the third of the 6-session series on the future of American power and influence. A couple of items first. A thank you to our major sponsors, as you have seen, Ledyard, Kendall, Caldwell Law, and also Wells Fargo. We have extra cards. If you didn't get one when you were coming in for questions, we will collect them here at the break. And we would also welcome any suggestions that you might have about improving this series each summer, as well as future topics that we might consider when we make a decision about next year. As you know, there's been a committee that's been working on this summer session, about 12 people. And this year, we've asked certain numbers of them to actually introduce the speaker. So I have the pleasure of bringing out John Matthews, who's been a consistent member of the committee. And John is from Woodstock, and he's going to introduce our speaker. John.
Thank you, Tom. A few years ago, we had a speaker who came here and looked out at the audience and said, I always figure that about 60% of the audience are really intently listening to the lecture. 30% are either dozing or have their hearing aids turned off. And the remaining 10% are having erotic thoughts. And he was an educator, if you can believe it. I know from your programs, you know a bit about Michael Kofman, that he's at the Kennan Institute at Woodrow Wilson Center, which is a very prestigious spot. And usually Michael is not lecturing to civilians. He's usually telling military people what they should be doing or how they should be relating to one another. The program doesn't tell you that Michael has a very interesting life story. He was born in the Ukraine. His family fled the Ukraine when the Soviet Union was falling apart and anti-Semitism was on the rise. And some of them ended up in Australia, most of them in the US. Michael ended up mainly in the Boston area, went to school, did some schooling in Brookline, and then at Northeastern University. And he became a Patriots and a Red Sox fan, which I hope he still is. So Michael's going to tell us what our military power is for and what we've done right and what we've done wrong. Michael Kofman.
Hope you can all hear me. Well, the answer to John's question is yes, I'm still a Patriots fan. I live in the DC area, and the only other options is the Redskins. And I don't know anybody in their mind who would trade the Patriots for the Redskins. Not alternatives. Thank you for this kind introduction. I want to thank the organizing committee, of course, Tom, John, and Lisa, bringing me up here. Never been to Dartmouth before. And I'm going to start along. To be honest, we don't have a lot of time. I know you're thinking, well, we got a whole hour to sit here. You guys have an hour. I have less than 60 minutes to explain the use of U.S. military power. And this is a presentation I've not given before. I built this for the audience, so hopefully we'll get through it in time. All right. Let me start off without further ado. What's so interesting for you? Quintessential question I think we have to ask ourselves is, can employment military power achieve desired political ends, right? And about 15 years ago, this was not even a question. This was a gimme. Of course it can. U.S. military power is awesome. We can use decisive force to achieve political ends. And 15 years down the line, when John had asked me to come here and speak about this, I thought back to a really interesting discussion presentation given at the Joint Staff by the three-star general, a very senior man, and somebody I considered to be one of the sharper knives in the drawer. And he was speaking to a foreign delegation, and what he said to them was that his job every day is to impinge upon the civilian leadership how limited military power is in achieving desired political ends. All right? And I think one of the quintessential lessons we walk away from the last sort of decade of war is that military power, as we have it, does not convert very well into achieving the political objectives we pose for it abroad. And of course, listening to this, I got to thinking that this is the essential question. It's a real challenge at that time as the Department of Defense. You know, it's a real challenge to what is it exactly we're all doing here, right? I mean, you don't need a $500 billion budget, 700,000 civilians, who knows how many men under arms, for coastal defense and strategic deterrence, right? So if we can't use military power to achieve political ends, you know, what is exactly that we're all doing here? So let me press forward a bit. Hopefully, we'll be able to answer this. My sense of it is we're going to kind of break this up into about 4 or 5 parts. And first, I'm going to take you kind of a trip back down memory lane to the beginning of 2001. So the long decade of war, it's really long because it's more than a decade. It's 14 years long, and it hasn't ended yet. That's why we call it the long decade of war. This is essentially our experience in, I would characterize it probably broadly 4 conflicts, as we know: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and the global war on terrorism, or the shadow war, however you want to call it. And we began this with, early on in 2001, with a perspective essentially the United States military in the modern age was going to achieve what was called multi-spectrum dominance. And that is, in Iraq, you knew this approach as shock and awe. That is the decisive application of blunt military power, employing what is called a slim fast military, which is a military that is low on ground troops and very heavy on air power and has technology as force multipliers, right? And what we quickly found out is that the application of shock and awe is decisive initially, but it was fundamentally based on a perception of what conflict would be in the 21st century that turned out not to be true, right? So it's a picture from 2003 March in Iraq, and the invasion of Iraq and essentially the taking of Baghdad. Shock and awe actually turned out to be quite brilliant for the first couple of weeks. But the way kind of Iraq goes, so if you look at the slide, you can clearly see that if we cut the military operation in Iraq at 21 days, it's a brilliant and decisive use of military power to achieve political ends. And if you look at the follow-on 7 years, not so much, right? It's a very difficult, labored effort to muddle through, salvage a complex contingency operation. And the reason this happens, of course, this insurgency was not supposed to happen, right? Our going into Iraq, our perception was that we were not going to do stability operations, we weren't going to do counterinsurgency, and that while shock and awe and the decisive application of military power would remove the government, remove the regime, the rest of it would be self-sorting, self-implementing, meaning there was a large set of assumptions going into it. And let me show you a slide of kind of, and as a consequence, this is a picture of guys trying to get an MRAP that's stuck in Afghanistan out of the mud. This is essentially, I think, a very good depiction of how we enjoyed stability counterinsurgency operations for the last 10 years, right? We got in very fast, and then we got stuck in the mud. But the reason this happened, again, is that we had a gross misunderstanding of how conflict unfolds, of what technology and military power could achieve, right? And as a result of this experience, while our military is now really processing the lessons of it, our overall sort of national security establishment has essentially moved on to this, where we want to talk about confrontation in space, confrontation in cyberspace, confrontation in drones. And as you can see this is very keyboard intensive, okay? And what it clearly doesn't involve is boots on the ground anywhere and counterinsurgency and stability operations anywhere, right? So not surprisingly, after the last 10 years in that experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, we are happy to fight people in any kind of space, be it space, cyberspace, with drones, but definitely not of the prolonged counterinsurgency. Here's kind of my broad characterization of experience last decade of war, right? So we have rapid military success from the decisive application of military power. Suddenly realize a lot of the big assumptions about what would then happen to that country and what would be required to deal with it are proven really wrong. Slog it out, and then we reach a moment where our military shines, okay? It takes a while to adapt, but our military is an amazingly adaptive organization. It adapts to the scenario. It becomes actually quite good at stability operations and starts to become quite effective at counterinsurgency operations and counterterrorism. But then we essentially reach a time or period where, okay, how fast can we salvage this before public will and support runs out? And what can we actually get done in a nation-building project, given the limited amount of resources that the country is willing to commit to it? And at the end, what happens is that the initial mistakes that we make at the beginning of both Iraq and Afghanistan, they prove decisive at the end. They really limit what we can achieve, right? The people we choose to put in power, the people we choose to partner with, and the big mistakes we make early on in those conflicts, and they're different in Iraq and Afghanistan. They prove decisive at the very end, so it becomes kind of like a typical Greek tragedian play, right? Where you do the right things, but by the time you do them, it becomes too late. And the way this looks on the ground is, we go in, we have this sort of mission accomplished moment. Right afterwards, we have an expected deterioration of security. And then we try to do nation building light, which is, oh, well, we didn't realize we were going to be doing this. What's the minimum amount of effort we can put in to salvage this? And we start dribbling in our labor. And then we actually realize how fast it's deteriorating, and we face a moment where we have to double down. And that's where the national security apparatus really comes together. And the one thing these two conflicts both demonstrated is that while we're terrible at predicting what's going to be required in either of these conflicts, in any of these nation-building projects, we do demonstrate that we have the political will to see it through, right? In both of these conflicts, we reach a point where a lot of people in the political establishment say, nothing's going to be salvaged here, it's time to get out, let's go home and cut our losses, and the nation chooses to double down. And the military does adapt, and it sees it through, but as I said, the clock begins to run out, and at the end, you're forced to move the goalpost to how far you've made forward progress, right? So if it was a football game, if you made it to the 70-yard line, you're forced to just move the goal up to the 70-yard line and say, all right, that's kind of a touchdown, let's go home. Here's kind of my depiction of the course of these operations, right? So if you kind of look at the timelines for Afghanistan and Iraq, quick military deterioration, then you have the surge and stabilization. Both departures are kind of question marks, right? Because we've left Iraq, but now it looks like we're definitely back, if not on the ground, then in our more traditional air power role. And we haven't really left Afghanistan yet, realistically, which I think is frankly a positive. And the reason why we haven't left Afghanistan, although the president says we'll be out in 2016, is because of the lessons we learned from our departure in Iraq in 2010, right? Basically, kind of what happens is, well, the circumstances of the wars are different, and this is not a presentation about that. The way the course ran is, we first really went with Rumsfeld's vision that it will be a decisive, limited conventional war. We'd be done in a couple of months. And he was right. And then afterwards, it became a prolonged counterterrorism mission. And then afterwards, we realized, wait, you can't possibly win a prolonged counterterrorism mission in this country. There has to be a political solution. You need to bring in all these other instruments of national power. And then the counterterrorism approach lost favor, and we went to the population-centric counterinsurgency approach and a long stability operation. But of course, when we did that, we quickly found out we don't really want to commit the resources to this. This takes a lot of time, money, and you need to convince the public that it's worthwhile. All of these efforts, they take many, many years, and a lot of them are not successful. And so we get as far as we can. We stabilize the situation, and in both conflicts, we get to a good enough phase, and then we transition from a counterinsurgency mission back to a counterterrorism one. That's largely what's happening in Afghanistan. All right, quick slide about the cost. If you look at the cost of the slide, these are crude numbers, they're arguable, but if you look at the cost, what you'll see is that financially, the use of U.S. military power is incredibly expensive, but the costs are relatively low with respect to number of troops lost. These are just ours, not the overall coalition ones. The important takeaway is that you see that the costs on the troops of actual losses are small. The cost to our country financially is massive. And look at the bottom parts, the cost to the country that we invade and the country we try to do the nation-building projects in are also colossal, right? And what you should walk away from this is see that the utility of U.S. use military power, how we use it, is very capital intensive, okay? We cannot do it in any other way, right? And we got to this incredibly capital-intensive use of U.S. military power by initially conducting an operation that was going to be incredibly cheap and efficient, right? That was the entire concept behind both of these wars. All right. Last, another important slide about cost, which is counterinsurgency and instability operations are a really ugly business, okay? And prolonged operations, they inevitably lead to collateral damage, to war crimes, friendly fire incidents. This is basically a numbers game. The longer you are in the country conducting this, there's no HR PowerPoint briefing you can give to people that will prevent this from happening, right? Any given day, there will be a bomb dropped on a wedding, there might be a friendly fire incident, and one morning a staff sergeant may wake up and decide to go into town and massacre half the people there, right? That may not happen today, it may not happen tomorrow, but if you're somewhere for 13 years, rest assured it will happen. And every time it happens, these incidents will substantially wipe out the political gains you've made with the people there and with the international community. This is a permanent feature of war, and we have a notion, I think a very disconnected notion from reality here, that warfare is somehow clean and that these are isolated incidents and that they're avoidable. They're not avoidable, okay? All right, they're statistics, and you're going to hit the statistics the longer you're conducting these military operations in another country. One of the big things that it definitely costs the United States is it hurts U.S. credibility. It costs the dignity of the United States, for sure. And it severely affects the other instruments of national power, our ability to conduct diplomacy abroad, because it hurts our credibility, especially our moral credibility. So the longer we are involved in these conflicts, the higher the price we pay in this international arena. And there's absolutely no way to avoid it. All right, finally, so this is a very real slide. General McChrystal saw the slide. This was presented to him, I think, in 2009 or 10. I can't remember the exact year. And, almost jokingly, he saw us, he said, wow, okay, if we can figure that out, we'd be done by now. So, so the question is, how do we get here from Donald Rumsfeld's vision that we will have rapid dominance across all spectrums and domains, we will overwhelm the enemy, we will achieve very quick success, and then we'll be out, right? And the situation will be self-stabilizing, right? And the thing is that the revolution in military affairs, as he sort of advances, is really based on kind of an incredibly naive and uninformed view of the course of conflict and what the consequences of applying military power would be, and then what kind of trajectories countries take after you apply this military power to them. And what we learned is they're not self-sorting, right? If you take a vase and you smash it with a hammer and it breaks into lots of little pieces, our notion was that then afterwards, without any serious continued application of military economic power, it would reorganize itself into a shape that we would find pleasing, okay? And it does not, as it turns out, right? You're left holding it. And if you're not left holding it, other people will come, and I'll talk about them later, and they will apply their military power, right, to change it into a shape that they find more pleasing. So take a second, read this. Figure out which part of this I agree and which part of this I don't agree with. I color-coded them. So another comment from Waldo said the U.S. military has many virtues, but is not good at running other countries, and it's not likely to get much better at it with practice. We have a capital-intensive army that places a premium on firepower, which I completely agree with, and we're a country whose own unusual melting pot history has made us less sensitive to the enduring power of nationalism, ethnicity, and local forces. Yes, but we've learned about that, okay? That's what our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan has taught us. We learned a great deal about that at the military level, all right, and amongst institutions. Our leadership, our society, not so much, right? And if you kind of, obviously I'm from DC, and I work in DC. If you understand DC, and DC history begins today very quickly, right? So we're probably about 5-10 years away from somebody else coming in and having a great idea as to how we can apply military power without then having to pay any subsequent cost for it, and how after the application of military power, the situation will be self-sorting and there's very little to risk, right? But I really disagree with Walt with his first point, because this is essentially the ostrich approach, and it's precisely the approach that the U.S. military took after Vietnam, which is, if we don't prepare to do it, then they won't make us do it. No, that's exactly what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the last thing you want to do is you want to waste the fact that we finally have a military that's exceptionally trained and adapted as a force to conduct these operations. The last thing you want to do is say, yeah, that really didn't work out, so I think the best idea is just to agree that we're not going to do this ever again. Because we will be doing it again, and actually probably a lot sooner. And I'm going to talk about that a bit later, due to the change in the spectrum of conflict, right? But I fundamentally agree that we really need to get out of the mindset that we press the M button to win, the M button being military power, right? What we do have to do is, as he says, is work a lot harder on having an approach in the world that minimizes the risk of getting ourselves into this kind of war, all right? But the number one thing is that we are prepared and we maintain the preparedness in the political will to engage in this kind of conflict, and that we don't waste what we've learned and we don't waste what we've done with our institutions, right? Because this is the future. And the ostrich approach of sticking your head in the sand saying, yeah, we're just never going to do this again, it'll be fine. It won't work. Let me talk about Libya. This is really an important, one of the more important slides, I think, in my presentation. So I really see Libya as kind of the ultimate misuse of military power in our last decade, right? And it's a case, it's a really demonstrative case where if you literally venture nothing, if you actually venture less than Donald Rumsfeld does on Iraq and Afghanistan, if you venture absolutely nothing, what you will gain, right? What the outcomes are of taking zero risk. And if you choose that you're not going to own any of the problems. So I'm going to quote Ivo Dalder, who was our ambassador to NATO, very recently this year, says, unfortunately, the way Libya has evolved demonstrates just because you give people the opportunity to decide their own future, they don't always decide in the right or best way, in the way that we would have wanted. So the situation in Libya has gone from bad to worse and is horrific in many dimensions. The future doesn't look much brighter. Right. So when I read this, what I try to understand is exactly how in 2011 it was possible to think that if you give people the quote-unquote the opportunity to decide their own future, they don't always decide in the right or best way or in the way we would have wanted. Because our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan had already taught us precisely that. That if you take a country in the Middle East and you crack it, all right, and your notion is afterwards the people there will make the right choices and they'll make good decisions, it'll reform itself into some sort of stable quasi-democratic state, the answer is no, it won't. Okay? And we had those both cases, and in Libya, I think, not to the surprise of many people, completely the opposite happened. And this was definitely a case where there was a strong argument between the Department of Defense and the State Department, and Bob Gates was on one side of it, Hillary Clinton was on the other side of it, and Bob Gates went out. The military, based on an experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, said this is not how we should be using military power, right? This is, again, that we will do the bare minimum, combine air power with special forces, conduct regime change, right? And then invest nothing in this country to see it through, right? And in retrospect, the administration admits that we should have done more to see us through, but the lesson of this is that the less you venture, the less you gain, and the greater the catastrophe and calamity that you create. And it very much follows along this glide path, right? In Libya, we risked absolutely nothing, chose to own none of the problem, and you see the consequence of Libya today, right? It's essentially degenerating into anarchy and different militia states fighting and warring with each other. And I think part of this also came from people who were involved during the intervention in Kosovo, and they learned very much the wrong lessons from that, right? They really wanted to avoid, if I want to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe, and I want to avoid a stability operation, and I want to avoid doing counterinsurgency, and I don't want to put any boots on the ground, and I don't want to spend any money, and I don't want to be involved in the follow-on process, and I want to avoid all of those things collectively, Libya is what I will do, right? And the Libya you see today is what you will get as a result. The result of there's no more Libya to speak of. It's done. Let me talk about the successful use of military power, which is the shadow war. And this is essentially how I think incredibly and brilliantly we had evolved our counterterrorism mission. And I think it's one of the best success stories of application of U.S. military power. This is the actual thing where I think Donald Rumsfeld proved right in retrospect, right? That using force multipliers and information-driven military and intelligence apparatus and modern technology, we can decisively apply military power against the terrorism problem, right? This is not a strategy, though, and it's important to understand this is an approach, okay? And until the day, this approach, in my mind, is what we'll do and what we're going to do until somebody comes up with a grand strategy for how we eliminate the contextual sources of terrorism between Southeast Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, Middle East, and North Africa, right? So you have to understand, to put it crudely, this is essentially lawn mowing. The grass grows back every 2 weeks, and you have to go back out to mow it. And it's not a strategy, it's an approach. And there's no alternative to it. But we've been incredibly effective in this, frankly. The drawback of this, of course, is that it actually is much more expensive and requires a much heavier ground presence than it looks. You need to have bases abroad to enable all those technologies. It's not like in the movies where a bunch of special forces guys go off and do this. You have to have bases. You have to have a lot of air and military assets in place to support them. It's far more complicated than it seems, and that means you have to partner with other countries. That means you always have to be there. In order to have a counterterrorism capacity, you always have to be there. And what that means is that in some way or another, we will never leave. We're going to be in the Horn of Africa, we're going to be in North Africa, we're going to be in the Middle East, we're going to be in Central Asia, if you want to continue doing this successfully. But it has definitely been one of the greatest success stories and the best investment in the use of US military power. All right, let's shift gear. Power and context, right? Why do we always use military power? How about trying something else, right? Where are the other sort of instruments in the national toolkit, right? So we have very well developed the DIME concept, and this concept essentially, you can read it up there. This is all supposed to work together, right? We apply this to a conflict. We apply this to major national security problems. All the ships will sail in the same direction. The band will play together. We're going to bring all our instruments of national power to bear in the pursuit of national interests, right? Of which the military power is one. It may be a major one, but it is one. The other three are part of the band, and they're supposed to play together. We're supposed to have unity of effort. That is the concept, and that is the ideal of how we'd like to use, military power. Let me show you the practice in the United States. So here, as you can see, what we do is we have very, very effectively worked out the military arm, trained and practiced it to the point that it's just incredibly jacked compared to all the other instruments of national power. What happens is, when we go and try to apply these to a conflict, and by the way, we only realized that we really needed these other three when the vision of decisive use of military power will solve all the problems collapsed. And then we said, oh, yeah, so to do stability operations and counterinsurgency, you actually need a political solution, and you need to have an economic reconstruction effort, and you need diplomacy, and you need allies to come. So we actually need to get the band back together to do this, because before we thought that just military power was going to do it and there'd be no problem. But when it comes to plus, of course, we find out the military ends up all the mission, and you can appoint your special representative, ambassadors, whatnot, but ultimately the execution ends up in the hands of the military. The military owns all the people, it owns the real estate there, it owns the assets, it has all the authorities. And in our systems, oftentimes, these elements, they don't come together very effectively, and what you get is you get very large M and very small everything else. And in many respects, actually, I think our political culture likes it, because in our political culture in the United States, we demand results. And the thing that gets you results now, whether incredibly successful or incredibly unsuccessful and destructive, is the military. The military always gets you results right off the bat, whether you like them or not. The other ones take a long time to work. It's hard to tell if they're working in progress. Even our rescue humanitarian missions are generally a mission that's owned by the military, right? Haiti earthquake happened. Who immediately deployed to Haiti, took over the entire airport to call over the operations? US military, right? Earthquake happens in Pakistan. Who shows up? US military, right? Tsunami in Japan. Who shows up? US military. Yes, there's an economic aid effort on the way. Who's going to execute that aid mission and who's going to run that area? US military, okay? But the goal is, in order to successfully manage these conflicts, is to have unity of effort without unity of command, right? So we don't have, we have all these different parts of the bureaucracy, and Department of Defense is one of them, and we don't have unity of command amongst them, but we're supposed to have unity of effort when we use military power. In the case like Afghanistan or Iraq, we're all supposed to be working on the same mission, DoD has, their motto, one team, one fight. I think this is probably a more realistic depiction of what unity of effort without unity of command looks like, and what our experience has been with it. And that's essentially, you have unity, we had very good unity of effort for probably about the first 2 years after 9/11, when people perceived the real mission behind these conflicts and a real national imperative. And as we transitioned towards planning for Iraq, and the political messaging changed from the president, from the leadership, the unity of effort started to dissipate, and we got back to our basically tradition, infighting over resources. Why should Department X delegate staff to this mission to help the Department of Defense win in this conflict, right? So the civilian capacity isn't there. The will is often not there. And there are different visions for the conflict. And if you read the background of these conflicts, you'll find, in Afghanistan, the president appointed Ambassador Holbrooke, right, a special representative. And his vision was that we should negotiate with the Taliban much earlier on and find a political solution to the conflict. And the vision of the militaries was that we need to first pulverize the Taliban, okay, and then force them to the negotiating table, much later on with a much weaker hand. And guess which one of those two approaches won out? The latter one, all right? And I assure you the military approach most of the time will win out. Libya is a good example when it didn't, because the military said, let's not use military power. And the rest of the political establishment says, yeah, let's give it a whirl. I mean, roll the dice, no risk. But the reality of it is, you know, when you have these other instruments of national power, I kind of picture us trying to walk 3 dogs and a bear together, you know? Like, the military is the bear. You know what's going to happen, all right? It's going to pull you along, right? You're going to go where the military takes you. And the other 3 dogs, they bark really loudly, and you hear them in D.C., but the Pentagon has more staff than the entire State Department does, right? That's the reality of it. Now, we can really make DIME work, but look at what I put in parentheses. The only time we think about how we're going to achieve the pursuit of national interest with these other instruments of national power is when the prospect of using military power is so bad, we don't want to do it. And it has to be really bad for us not to push that button, right? And the challenge with it, of course, is that when we use the other instruments of national power, we really don't like it. Our political culture doesn't like it. Our allies don't like it, right? And we've gotten to a place, I think, now in the national security establishment where the military really gets this, and the military really understands the limits of what the use of power and force can achieve with respect to political objectives, right? The political establishment, not so much, and is very divided. I think the current president of the United States understands it very well, which is why he chose not to apply a military solution to Syria, obviously in Ukraine. And Iran really dates back to the Bush administration, and I think my view on it is that it was very seriously considered, the use of military power against Iran, and the prospects of what that would achieve versus the risks were so bad that they decided not to do it. And I assure you, if that administration could have seen a way forward with military action, they would have done it. All right? So, I mean, one big question, of course, is how long before we forget these lessons, but I'll tell you, the drawback of these 3 cases I gave you is that in Syria, we were going to use military power, and we diverted course at the 11th hour. We were really thinking about it. And it's actually really a Russian diplomatic coup, that we should use diplomacy and achieve something in our national interest, which is to disband Syria's chemical weapons arsenal, right? But we may revisit that question. In Ukraine, we didn't use military power because, well, one, we'd be getting into a direct proxy war with Russia, but we're still thinking about it. We may very well send lethal weapons before this year is out. But the prospects for employing force in Syria and dribbling in steadily with our military presence, they're quite bad. And that's what makes us hesitant, right? So in Syria, diplomacy. In Ukraine, economic power to pressure Russia with sanctions, diplomatic power to rally our allies, military power to reassure our allies, who we have defense pacts with in NATO. And in Iran, a very, very long timeline of using economic power to sanction them, constrain them, and then eventually diplomacy, right? If I was to ask you, how do you think in D.C. people perceived the lack of use of military power against Syria? Poorly, right? We should do something militarily really, really questionable and stupid in order to defend U.S. credibility, because the president drew a red line. And in Ukraine, again, poorly, right? All of Congress wants to send lethal weapons to Ukraine, right? Who knows what will happen after that, but we want to. And in Iran, I'm sure you all have your own opinions on the recent deal that was signed with Iran, right? We move on to the next section of this. So as you got from the last component of this presentation, I kind of showed the conception of how the military is supposed to fit into, amongst other instruments of national power, and how it actually plays. Here, sort of today, let's get off memory lane and let's stop talking about the mistakes we made in the last decade and talk about the mistakes we could be making in the next one, right? There's plenty of opportunities out there. So, change security environment. As you see, Russia's changed appearance somewhat while we were out having adventures in the Middle East and Central Asia. And China's changed quite a bit too. And as you see this, it's not nearly as bad as it looks, but if you understand sort of the growth of Chinese military capability, the states that we consider to be regional powers or our next peer competitors, really for the last 20 years, the understanding was US was number 1, China number 2, and Russia number 3. And if you look at my hands, the reality of it was that we're number 1, China's number 2, and Russia's number 3, right? Our defense spending is equal to the next 17 countries in the world all put together. Well, sort of that giant gap between us and our peers, and more importantly, not the gap in spending, but also the gap in capability, right, in technology and capability, has been shrinking over the last 15 years, right? So we're still number 1 by a long shot. They're number 2, Russia's number 3, but the parity is a lot closer. This is not problematic. The only problem with this is that you see the 3 countries we have defense pacts with, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, all happen to be in the redder part of the chart and not in the yellow part of the chart. And this chart demonstrates basically the ability for anti-access and area denial, right? How far China can project its military power and deny us access to that region, that part of the world. So let's take a look at Russia. Again, this looks better because it's not all in red. But if you look, it doesn't seem very problematic for us. The only problem, again, is that if you look at the Baltic states and if you look at Poland and you look at Romania, you'll notice that they're all well within the boundaries of that chart. And this chart basically shows, again, the ability of China to deny access to the area with air defense, with anti-ship weapons, et cetera, et cetera. And we all have, again, through NATO, defense pacts with these allies. So it obviously raises you the question, we are obligated, in the event of military conflict, to come here into this excitingly red zone and into this red zone to defend these people, right? This is a very important challenge and a big change in the security environment in the next 15 years. It didn't look like this, right? And finally, I mean, our near competitors have really changed how they use military power, right? Nuclear weapons are back. And these bomber overflights and a lot of the sort of conflicts in the South China Sea with China, this is them using their military power for coercion. We do not use our military power for coercion, okay? We use our military power, period. We don't coerce people with it. We just use it. And then things happen, right? And our best response to this is not coercion, it's deterrence and reassurance. So they've chosen to use their military power for coercion against their neighbors, which happen to be our allies, and we've chosen to respond by using ours for deterrence and reassurance. That's our answer to it. But this is a big challenge, because when you raise the specter of nuclear weapons, which we haven't heard about, again, in a very long time, it immediately grabs the United States' attention, because it's one of the few things we really hear and we really care about, right? It's an existential threat to the United States, and when we hear about the fact that strategic stability may no longer be granted, like a guarantee, where we don't know what Russia's intentions are, whether it's just saber rattling, whether it's playing around, it makes us consider worst-case scenarios. It actually affects us quite a bit, right? These sort of low probability, high impact events. And that's what it's intended to do. That's what it's intended to do. And it's quite effective in that respect, meaning when we deal with Russia, we are forced to once again consider what could happen and what a conflict escalation chain could look like, and that there are nuclear weapons at the end of it every time. And we didn't think in these terms before, since in the post-Cold War environment, the last 24 years. We never thought in these terms, and now we're back to thinking again. Finally, with respect to our allies, there's kind of good news and bad news, which is some of our allies have really changed themselves and empowered themselves. Japan is one of them, right? Poland might be another example. Countries that have really risen to defending their own national security interests, increasing defense spending, changing their constitution like Japan just recently did. We really kind of have to change the formula. I borrowed this formulation from Barry Posen at one point. I heard him say this, and I thought it was quite good, where he said, the challenge with sort of our alliances with some of our key allies in these regions that I showed you is, the framework we've had running for this whole time is that, we agree to defend them, and they agree to help. And the framework we need to have is that they agree to defend themselves and we agree to help, right? And with Japan, we are steadily transitioning these frameworks, right? That's what it's been with Japan. We agree to defend them and then they'll participate in some fashion in that enterprise, right? And now we're starting to transition with them to the point where they will invest the resources to defend themselves and we will help, right? I think Libya was a pretty awkward example of us trying to put our allies in the lead. I know the background of that operation. So for the United States, when we told our European allies, listen, you're going to primarily do Libya. We're going to come in for the first 2 weeks, clear Libyan air defense, make it easy for you, and then you guys come in and handle the rest. They're obviously very suspicious and apprehensive, because normally when you're talking about a military intervention, the United States pushes everybody aside to get to the front of the line and says, hey, everybody's following me. And when the United States said, no, we're going to stand behind you guys go first, people were very scared in Europe. And what we found out from that intervention, though, is that while our European allies are capable of conducting a military intervention, there are very colossal deficits in their conventional capability, right? They ran out of precision-guided munitions. They couldn't do targeting very well. A lot of the assets they had used in 2011, they were writing off that year, meaning they're gone. We won't be seeing them again. And the result is we consistently struggle to empower our allies and to try to put them in the lead, because they don't have the capacity to operate without us. And I think a big lesson from Libya is that there is really very little prospect of our allies coming together and conducting any of these military interventions and exercising their military power without us, all right? And we can only sort of, Libya was a case of, okay, you've learned to ride, here you go. Let's see how far you can get on this bicycle. And very quickly, we had to catch back up and attach the training wheels to it. We'll talk a bit about future conflicts. There's another good quote here from Michael Howard that I think kind of sums up and is pretty clear. That no matter how clearly one thinks, it's impossible to anticipate precisely the character of future conflict. Bob Gates a while ago said that, that we actually have a really great track record in predicting future conflict and where it will take place. We have never gotten it right. We have 100% consistency in it. We have never gotten it right. All right. And I think he's absolutely dead on. But so the future, right? Some of your kids or grandkids might play this game. Essentially, in the future, we still think just like we thought in 2001. At least that's what popular culture tells us, that technology is going to drive the strategy, it's going to drive the course of conflict, the type of operations we're going to do. And that's very much what we thought in 2001, right? And the lesson from the decade of war for us were that all the old conceptions about conflict are still true. All that stuff Clausewitz said, right? That it's ultimately a contest of will. That the course of conflict is very uncertain and unpredictable, which is why you need to prepare for all the contingencies instead of just, having a really brilliant set of assumptions, right? That war, at the end of the day, is politics by other means. So this is a vision of popular culture. Let me show you our vision, because we kind of agree. Our concept is a little different, though. In our vision of future conflict, we're going to be a lot further away, and actually, ideally, nobody will even see us, right? That's the dream. So we also see, the future of advanced warfare. This is not a joke. This thing's very real. It's being launched at Bath Iron Works. The takeaway I see here is that we also see the future as one where we're going to be engaged in advanced warfare, and that warfare will be conducted through an employment of technology that puts us even further and further and further from the battlefield, right? And part of the reason we have to do that is because when I showed you the changing regional security environment, you saw that map off of China and Russia, and what that told you is they're going to be keeping us further and further away, because what they learned from our decade of war is that once the United States is allowed into the region, it's allowed to start conducting the operation, right? The use of military power is decisive, and then afterwards it could be catastrophic, but it is decisive, and it will unfold very rapidly. And so their lesson is, don't let the United States in. Like, if you can keep them maybe 500 miles away, that would be ideal, right? And our challenge is, how are we going to get in there? And of course, the first answer is, well, how can we continue to apply military power further and further away? Of course, the challenge with these sort of visions of the future of modern warfare and conflict and advanced warfare is it takes us a lot back to 2001, what we were thinking back then. And the problem is that this keeps coming up, right? And this is ISIS, and ISIS at this point makes, I think, Al-Qaeda look like a Swedish massage. It's, you know, the only advantage of this problem is that we're incredibly familiar with the real estate at this point. You know, Vali Nasser wrote that we're not in the Arab world of pre-2011, where you have all these stable regimes that are our friends, and even those that are not our friends have control of their territory. We are now in an era in the Middle East that is orders of magnitude more complicated. We have to take stock of the reality rather than only focus on what Iran is doing, right? So the message is the Middle East has changed dramatically. It has changed dramatically. And that while we continue to plan for these visions of advanced warfare, and as I showed you, the defining strategy for dealing with China's air-sea battle, which some of you guys might say, well, what's the Army going to do? And maybe I'll get to that. But you know, this keeps coming up, right? The Middle East gets a vote. Our adversaries get a vote. ISIS gets a vote. And their vote is that the United States is not going to 100% exit Iraq in 2011. The United States is going to have to be back in Iraq. It's going to have to continue dealing with the Middle East. We will not be able to effectively, cleanly pivot away from the Middle East and off to dealing with China. And Russia got a good vote too, because we really didn't see ourselves returning to in-area operations in Europe or the European theater, right? And finally, the return of history. History is back, and it has tanks. Right? Francis Fukuyama said after the end of the Cold War that, you know, this is the end of history. Okay? Democracy and liberalism prevailing is, you know, almost essentially inevitable. That's the mission. So this was a really fun and exciting period of 24 years where we had a lot of opportunities and we had a lot of options and choices. Will we do a humanitarian intervention mission here? How about peacekeeping there? You know, how will we reshape the world? How will we advance the cause of democracy, liberalism, this and that? And we were seriously challenged by authoritarian regimes. China was barely, you know, a contender that was up and coming. Russia was very weak, seeming in decline. And we definitely didn't see the Middle East becoming the way it has turned since 2011. That's basically over, right? And so now we're back to dealing with a world that I think looks a lot more similar and a lot harsher for us as it did during the Cold War, meaning we will have to really challenge ourselves with how we pursue our national interests versus our values. There will not be this freedom of values, interests. We can get this all done at the same time. Meaning the pursuit of our interests will contest our values. We will have a lot less choices and a lot more requirements. These things will look a lot less like hobbies and a lot more like jobs. They're not going to be optional. And the use of our military power will be much harder, as I showed you, that changing security environment, right? Well, I kind of posted that slide for you initially that both Iraq and Afghanistan were very capital intensive, but not manpower intensive in the amount of casualties we took. That's going to change, right? The change that you see is that future conflicts will involve a lot more casualties, and we're going to have to be a lot more risk tolerant, right? We've basically had the luxury of engaging in conflict with very low casualties, and I think the public has a misperception that that's how war is going to go in the future, right? And it's not. All right. Here's a great sort of breakdown by my colleague Frank Hoffman. This is a spectrum of modern conflict, right? And if you look at it, the slide is basically his. The only thing I added was the two arrows at the bottom that says less likely and more likely, which is my vision of what we're going to be seeing more of and what we're going to be seeing very little of, right? So while we're still putting a lot of resources into dealing with, you know, theater conventional warfare and limited conventional warfare, these contingencies with China and Russia, which we have to prepare for, what we're going to see most of is a lot of conflict that falls below the threshold of war. And you're going to say, well, let me go a couple slides back. How's that going to help with it, right? This is gray zone ambiguous conflict, irregular warfare, terrorism, hybrid warfare. Where does this fit into that? It doesn't, right? So I think we need to understand that this is why I very strongly disagree with that first sentiment by Stephen Walt. I said, oh, we're never going to do this right, so we should just, you know, the plan should be that we're not going to do this again. We're going to be seeing a lot more of this, and that's actually what we are going to be doing. We're going to be seeing a lot more conflicts that involve the application of what we learned in counterinsurgency stability operations, what we've learned from conducting the sort of shadow war and terrorism with special forces and drones. That's a lot more of the future, right? So, and even this kind of This is essentially largely limited conventional warfare, but hybridized with a lot of aspects of hybrid warfare, meaning you combine, there's irregular warfare in here, there's some terrorism criminality, there's insurgency, and there's limited conventional warfare in Europe. And we're going to have to be coming up with more responses to that and a lot less with responses to this traditional theater conventional warfare threat. All right. I'm almost done, but I'm going to hit you with a couple of verbose slides at the end here, right? So back to the essential question, when, how, and why should we use force, knowing what we know today? This is my great intellectual contribution. Hold on. I need to have one of these Marco Rubio moments. It's okay, I'm not running for president. I can't, I wasn't born here. All right, let's get back to the old debate. And I could have started with this set of slides. There's only a couple more, but I'd rather end with them. So, right, this is our thinking in the 90s. And Powell Weinberger really talked mostly about the conditions under which we go to war. And that was explicit in their thinking. Implied in their thinking was how we use force. And they lean to the side of overwhelming force, massive deployment, preparation for all the contingencies and possibilities that will follow, right? Manpower intensive. But they're thinking, you know, if you kind of read through these bullets, this was our conception in the 90s before we get to Donald Rumsfeld, Revolution in Military Affairs, and how we applied force in the 2000s. And that was very much a repudiation of Powell's and Weinberger's thinking. This sounds great. The problem with this is that this presents, you know, sort of this unicorn scenario. Meaning we would never go to war because pretty much nothing would satisfy these conditions, right? And in what I showed you as the current spectrum of conflict, how many conflicts will fall below the threshold of war, right? How many conflicts will not pose a direct conventional threat to the United States necessarily? We are not in a position to have such an absurdly high and unrealistic standard for when we're going to be using military power, right? And more importantly, as you see, sort of our assets and our capabilities, relatively speaking, decline, and those of our adversaries increase, and our challenges proliferate, the challenges to us and to our allies, which we partly own, proliferate around the world. We don't have the luxury of standing by and saying, okay, yeah, so we're going to have to tick all these boxes and it has to be a vital national interest. Because, you know, for example, if I was telling you ISIS, I'd say, do you think ISIS poses an existential threat to the United States right now? And many of you might say, no, it doesn't. But I assure you, if you don't deal with it now, it will later, right? You know, if I told you, well, how about a scenario where ISIS takes over all of Iraq and then it takes over half of Syria, which it already has, and then it crushes Jordan, which it might easily do. When it gets to the borders of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, I assure you, it'll become a vital national interest, right? But Powell largely talked about when we use force. And I kind of grouped Rumsfeld with humanitarian interventionists, which they might really not like. But I tend to see this as very, very close fellow travelers on the thinking of the use of military force, right? And Russell will talk a lot more about what kind of operation we use, right? How we apply the force. That was explicit, but implied were the conditions under which we use force, right? And Rumsfeld's view is kind of, well, the conditions are very important. Decisive application of US military power will achieve the initial base political objectives, and then the situation afterwards, it'll become essentially self-sorting, right? And the way we got into this was we had kind of a completely incorrect understanding of those countries, partly acquired from exiles and people we chose to work with. But ultimately, the perception there is that there's really fairly little risk. The limits on the United States and what the United States can do are by and large political will, not military capability, right? And that was the beginning, where we thought military power will translate really well into achieving political objectives on the ground. And why, I kind of put them together. I mean, you can say preemptive from the Rumsfeld perspective or protective from the humanitarian intervention perspective, which is what Libya was, you know, proactive. But ultimately, it's about limited objectives. And this is the conversation between these two slides that I think we really need to have, right? So this part is way too resource intensive for us to do at this point. We have way too many challenges and too many conflicts that we will have to deal with. And it's unrealistic. We could never go to war, right? Unless Russia essentially chooses to invade all of Europe, we're going to have a hard time meeting this criteria. And we know why Rumsfeld's vision of conflict won't work either, because I just told you about it for 50 minutes, right? So we just had an experience applying this, and what we find out is that this notion of slim, fast use of military power will not work out, right? So we will have, we're going to be looking at two scenarios. One is we'll just apply military power, and we're all just essentially going to raid the country, which is what it is. It's military raiding. We'll raid the country like we did Libya, change the regime, and then good luck. And we see how those ships fall. Or we stay to conduct a counterterrorism mission, in which case we have what Tom Friedman said, you know, Rumsfeld vision is have just enough troops to lose, right? We employ just enough economic and military power to be decisively losing the conflict over a longer timeline, right? But this is a challenge we have to think about when we use military power and how we're going to use it. So on the one hand, this gives us a lot of flexibility, a lot of agility, right, this notion. On the other hand, we know from direct experience in our recent history that it is not true. And we have to find a balance between these approaches of using military power as the first thing you reach for, right, amongst your national power toolkits, as basically your tool of first resort, and using it as your tool of last resort. Another slide from Frank Hoffman. These are a couple points he had from a forthcoming work, but I rather like them. And this is, I think, a problem not with our military establishment, and maybe not even part of the political establishment. This is fundamentally a problem with us, right? Which is, this is where we are as a country. Really unreasonable expectations of victory at low cost, right? Very simplistic understanding of what blunt military power is going to achieve, right? And we still have plenty of people in Congress on Capitol Hill saying, well, yeah, stand up to the Russians, they're bullies. Got him over the head. Syria, you drew a red line, said you were going to do something, you didn't do it. Didn't bomb them. Should have bombed them, I would have bombed them. You know, Iran, what are we doing making this deal with Iran? So I'm wrapping up, don't worry. These are my thoughts. Where we are today as a result of these last 14, 15 years. Our military is incredibly feared. We are still militarily by far the most powerful country in the world and the most capable country in the world. China's military may be rising. It looks phenomenal on paper. China hasn't fought a war in over 40 years. The last war they fought was a 2-week thing against Vietnam, and they lost. So probably the last person in China that's been involved in military operations has got to be in their 50s at best. So that's a military that's very much unused, right? We have to speak objectively as to where we stand with respect to the rest of the world. But that being said, we are feared, but we are not respected as a country that uses military power competently or effectively. And a great quote from that last year was from Dmitry Rogozin, Deputy Defense Minister of Russia, where he said that the United States policy in the Middle East is like a monkey with a hand grenade, right? That's how Russia sees us. And that's not just how Russia sees us. That's actually how quite a few countries see the United States. That's actually how a lot of our allies see us in the Middle East as well. You know, world is less permissive, fewer assets, more challenges. And dominance across domains, that multi-spectrum dominance we started with in 2001, is diminishing. And part of the problem is that it's diminishing against our peer competitors, but the other problem is that it's not very applicable to most of the conflicts we're going to face, which is those ISIS guys I showed you, right? And we know that from our period of counterinsurgency, right, where we invade with tanks and we come out with mine-resistant vehicles, right, and all basically a very drastically reconfigured force and military. Here's my slide on very easy answers for application of military power. I know what you guys are thinking, wow, we brought this guy here, he spoke for an hour and didn't tell us what to do. What was the use of this presentation, right? Yeah, what's the answer to this problem? I have answers, don't worry. But I'm told that we have 45 minutes to an hour in Q&A. I would first prefer that you really think about this during break. I'm going to leave it on. So some of you probably figured out from the first slide that that's not what that Joint Staff Briefing room looks like. I've been in many of them over the course of my life. These are shots from Dr. Strangelove, one of my favorite films. So I'm going to be very happy to answer questions. And many of you are welcome to write in big capital letters what to do, question mark, for them. I will answer anything except my most hated question in DC. You cannot start any question with the words you did not mention, okay? Because in the 60 minutes that I have spoken between today and the Peloponnesian War, the things I didn't mention can fill this auditorium, right? On the use and misuse of military power. But I'm hoping after the break, we can have a really good conversation about what to do. All right, thank you, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much for all the questions. We have so many that we won't be able to get through all of them, but John Matthews is in control of this. He's a good MC, and he will do a good job. And thank you also for the ideas for next year. We appreciate that, and we'll look forward to having more in the weeks ahead. Over to John Matthews.
We have a lot of really good questions here. Michael, you forgot to mention, whoops.
you didn't mention. What about?
So, in your view, Michael, how do we undermine and defeat ISIS?
Okay,
what is the strategy to combat ISIS?
Okay.
Just a minor question.
Hold on. Before I answer that, let me make a comment about speaking too fast, because I do speak fast, and I've heard this before. I first encountered this problem when I was at Northeastern University as a kid, and I worked all evenings at Trader Joe's to make money. And I had occasionally customers who said, I don't want the bags you're bagging to be heavy, but I also don't want you to make too many bags. So I understand your disappointment that you would like a presentation on use and misuse of military power over the last 15 years, and you want it in an hour, but you don't wish for me to speak too fast, right? I just wanted to make that point because it's been many years now since I've seen this conundrum come up, you know? Now, the question was ISIS? What's the easy answer for ISIS? Is that it?
Yes. And also, as a corollary to that,
right.
Comment on the U.S. security zone on the Syrian border with Turkey. Is that any decent plan, or is it just the way to control the Kurds? So, yeah, a corollary is, would you comment on the security zone that Turkey and the U.S. are establishing on the Syrian border, and is that at all effective, or is it just a means to control the Kurds?
Okay, so, right, how do we deal with ISIS? Well, I think it's pretty clear to those of us observing how this conflict has progressed that we've consistently underestimated ISIS and the threat it posed for Iraq, and we've drastically overestimated the military capability of the Iraqi forces that we left there, their will to fight, and the ability of our allies to wager a part of this conflict on their own and in their own self-interest, right? Because they're the ones closest to the fire first. So the president made the quote that we're not going to chase every rabbit down the rabbit hole, down every rabbit hole in the Middle East. Pretty clearly, ISIS is not a rabbit, right? You know, maybe al-Nusra or some of these other ones you could call a rabbit, right? ISIS is more like a rabid bear, you know. My sense of it is that we have a real challenge where we cannot, on the one hand, continue with the formula of every time this sort of transnational terrorist threat and insurgency appears in the Middle East, our allies in the Middle East will be able to bat phone us, and we will show up to solve it for them. Because we just left there. We were just there for 7 years in Iraq and much longer in Afghanistan. It was very hard for us and very expensive. And what we also learned is that we are not ready to invest the political and economic and military resources required to see that mission through over the number of years it will take. In 2001, we thought it would take no years, so we were ready because we had no idea what we were going to get ourselves into, with a very bad and naive understanding of modern conflict. But it's 2014 and 2015, and now we understand what it would take, and our answer is we are not ready to invest that. It will take way too many years. So the challenge is, how do you combine what the United States brings to the table, which is awesome firepower and technology and intelligence resources, with ground forces there? And the answer is, remember I said we are at a point in the world where our interests and values are not going to travel together like this. Our interests and values are going to often be like that, right? And we will be choosing. And so our choice is that we will put together what seems, if I told you a couple of years ago, you'd think I was completely nuts, a coalition that consists of Iranian Shia militias on the ground, combined with our air power, Iranian allies Hezbollah, okay, along with the remnants of the Iraqi army that are able to fight as a capable force, funded both by Saudi Arabia and armed by Russia, okay? And that this is a constellation that Iran would serve as the ground force, which it really is. I'm sorry, there are a lot of Iraqi flags, but the real ground force against ISIS is Iran's Shia militias and Hezbollah, and US air power. And we are increasingly working together. The policy was that we would not coordinate airstrikes with them, and then after ISIS took Ramadi, we started to walk back that notion and have started talking about how we will coordinate US air power with essentially Iranian ground power, right? And so you say, what's the answer? Well, I guess if your best allies and the people who you spent 7 years building up as a military are not able to fight ISIS, maybe your best enemies can do it with you. I see the answer as a constellation between our only really good true allies down on the ground there, which is the Kurds, okay? People we've consistently depended on and worked with, and the people that most closely resemble anything that approaches values we have in this country. People who least approach values that we have in this country, maybe Iranian Shia militias, right? And a combination of Gulf money, Iraqi forces, our air power. But I think we're under the illusion that we will be able to suppress ISIS and prevent the total collapse of Iraq without further investment in boots on the ground. I think we are back in the mentality of 2001 to 2003, and maybe the way we kind of ran Afghanistan, right? I didn't talk about these, I didn't have time, but Afghanistan really 2003 to 2009, we invested a lot in local warlords and groups and militias, and we had a minimum force presence that was focused on counterterrorism, and we relied a lot on local proxies. And those choices really came back to bite us later on. So yeah, I think the answer with ISIS is no, we don't come back with 100,000 men to Iraq, definitely. And we can't just bomb them from the air, as we've already tried that approach actually, and it hasn't worked. So it's a constellation between our allies, our enemies who seem to be better at fighting than our allies, and an increasing investment of US resources. The main challenge I see is that we do not have a plan, and we are dribbling in. And that's exactly how we did Afghanistan and Iraq, dribbling in, right? And the administration right now, I think, is a little bit channeling Bob McNamara with statements like, we've killed 10,000 ISIS guys since the beginning of this campaign. We're killing 1,000 ISIS insurgents a month. You know, like this kind of thing, where It's completely irrelevant how many ISIS people we kill per day with airstrikes. Utterly irrelevant, right? We've killed this many per month, and Iraq has lost Ramadi, and there are actually not that many big cities in Iraq. So with regards to Turkey, that's a much simpler. So I don't think this is a brilliant Turkish plan. I think this is something probably that the United States had been working on with Turkey for quite a while. But we have a lot of competing interests with Turkey, both in the civil war in Syria and with what's going on in Iraq, right? So what I think is going on is finally got the Turks to use their military and take military action against ISIS. We're calling it a security zone or protective zone. As I was telling Tom earlier, it's like, well, why is it not a safe zone? Well, because a month ago was the anniversary of Srebrenica, one of the worst massacres in Europe during the Bosnian Civil War. And the reason that happened is because a bunch of people got together and decided we will declare Srebrenica as a safe zone, and all the refugees from that conflict should come in there. And of course, they couldn't be protected, and then they were taken out by buses and massacred. So what you're definitely not going to hear is this administration say a month after the anniversary of Srebrenica, we have a great plan, and our plan is to create a safe zone in northern Syria against ISIS, where refugees should go, because definitely nothing horrible will happen to them there. So instead it's a protective zone, and it's being set up by Turkey as a Turkish idea, and it's not our idea, because if it goes pear-shaped, then we will not be to blame. And we've gathered NATO to approve it and bless it, which of course it was going to. But I think this is really more of an evolving US approach to how to deal with Syria. What do I think the consequence will be? I don't quite understand the consequences of Turkey breaking the ceasefire that it's had for over 2 years with the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and attacking the Kurds and ISIS at the same time. I don't know where that's going to take them. I suspect from what I've seen is that Turkey has learned the lessons in Syria that we had learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is they thought Assad was going to fall quickly, and they had a close ally in Syria, and they completely changed their policy towards Syria, right, as one of regime change in Syria. And it turned out that he wasn't going to fall quickly at all. That would be a very bloody, brutal, and prolonged civil war, and proved quite disastrous for Turkey as a policy. And they've spent years trying to figure out what the way forward on Syria is. And we've been at odds, right? Because Turkey didn't want to cooperate with us against ISIS unless we resolved their primary security problem, which is Syria and the Assad regime. They invested in the fact that Assad has to go, their regime has to go. They've made their neighbor an enemy. And our approach was, well, it turns out Assad shouldn't go because actually compared to the al-Nusra Front and ISIS, he's the least worst guy out there. And you know, our understanding was that if we want to fight ISIS and that deal involves Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia, their terms of the deal is that if we're going to work together, then nothing happens to Assad and his regime. And our other set of partners in this enterprise, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, their terms are, if you want to work together against ISIS, then you have to develop and unfold a strategy for how you're going to eventually get rid of Assad and crush Iran's main ally, Syria. So if I just kind of see the way I laid this out for you, this creates a real puzzle, right? So your constellation of allies to fight ISIS have a real conflict of interest. And this was actually something Chuck Hagel was speaking to before he was fired, Secretary of Defense, but he was speaking to the fact that there was no clear plan for Syria, and that we were kind of trying to keep this together and keep these ships sailing in the same direction, but we understood that these two sets of countries that we need to fight ISIS have very contradictory interests. So what I think Turkey is going to do is, you're going to see the outcome of that contradiction. I'm sorry this is a long explanation, but anybody who gives you a simple explanation of anything happening to the Middle East is either selling something or maybe a journalist, but I just don't, I don't see it coming together in one brilliant, you know, pithy quote. I'm just not that good, right? So these conflicting interests, I think, are coming out in Turkey's policy, which is Turkey wants Assad gone. It doesn't want Kurdistan to form, which I think is inevitable, and take a large part of Kurdish, Turkish territory where Kurds reside. And we obviously don't want ISIS to continue making progress both in Syria and Iraq. So the Turks have decided that they will join us in the campaign against ISIS, as long as they get to create their own campaign against the Kurds, which are our allies. Right? I think that's, I mean, look, I'm just responding to the news of the last 3 days, so obviously this is not a brilliantly thought through answer, but this is what it looks like to me. I've been here since yesterday. So from what I hear, it sounds like the price of Turkey working with us against ISIS is that they get to conduct their own unilateral military campaign against our allies, the Kurds.
Well, here's another simple question, Michael. You can probably answer this in about 30 seconds.
Sure.
What's your opinion of the U.S.-Iran deal? And
Yeah.
what happens if Congress rejects it, especially what would be the reaction of our allies who've put in a lot of time and effort and prestige?
Yeah, first, the administration has completely banked 100% that if Congress rejects it, they don't have enough people to override the presidential veto. They made that clear to the Senate, and everybody in the Senate is mildly unhappy about that political approach, including a lot of people on the Democratic side. So the answer is the administration is certain that even if Congress rejects the deal, they won't be able to override their veto, and it'll stand. That's one. What I think about the deal, I think sort of as a glib comment, I think we did well, but the Iranians did much better. I think this deal is a classic example of why we as a political culture really can't stand the prolonged employment of economic and diplomatic power to achieve a result, and instead really like the decisive implementation of military power, because that gets stuff done really fast. It gets you an outcome, not the one necessarily you want, not the one you would like, not one that won't have tragic consequences further on, but Iran's a really good example of this deal. So here's my view. I am confident that if this deal falls through, we can absolutely still bomb them. All right, I'm sure of it. I'm sure of it that we can still do it, right? I don't see Iran going anywhere. So my view is I really like this deal. I actually really like this deal. I really just like the notion of the United States attempting to use economic and diplomatic power to resolve something. I mean, you know, it's kind of like we've tried all the alternatives. Let's see if we could do the right thing. I mean, just a shot. You can't say that in the last 15 years we haven't tried all the other variations of use of military power. Let's stay for 7 years. Let's do population-centric counterinsurgency for 14 years. Let's not do anything, bomb them, and hope it assembles itself in something that looks good. You know, I mean, it's a sort of, we've tried the alternatives. I think this is very much worth a shot. The options are, here's the thing. What concerns me, what I don't like about this deal, is, as I said, we as a political culture don't like it, and our allies hate it. The reason our allies hate it is because they're very used, you know, it's like cocaine. They're very used now to this drug, that the United States is always going to be there, and it's always going to come there with military power to threaten or coerce or deter their adversaries. And if that doesn't work, we're going to roll the dice and use it, right? And then once we use it, we're going to show up and we're going to own the mission. We're going to own the real estate, and we'll be there for 7 years, 10 years, whatever. And those allies really don't like it because it has very uncertain results. But my view is, one, you know, this is what the application of economic power and diplomacy looks like. It's not a bad deal. And, you know, you hear these hilarious things. People say, well, it's not a bad deal. OK, well, what's your idea? We should get, you know, a better deal. Oh, why don't we think of that, a better deal? Why stop at a better deal? We should go back and get the best deal, right? I mean, what were we thinking getting this deal? Apparently, there was a better deal and a best deal down the line, you know? Yeah, I'm sure John Kerry had never thought of that. It never occurred to him that we should get a better deal. It's amazing. You know, I'm from the School of Foreign Service. They should teach that as a course. You should get a better deal, right? Yeah, this is the better deal and the best deal, okay? This is what we were able to agree to after many, many years, all right? That's how I see it. And the question is, well, what if it doesn't come through? The consequences are unpredictable. Well, what I just painted to you in 50 minutes is that the consequences of the application of force are less predictable and possibly far more expensive. that the uncertainty of conflict has traveled with us for all the last thousands of years, and technology, all right, and the modern information age has not allowed us to any better predict what the trajectory of conflict will be, what will be required of us once we initiate it, and what the consequences will be for the people there and for the rest of the region and our allies. So if you think the outcome of this deal is unpredictable, you should really do a slide for yourself and look at what the potential outcomes of a military conflict are, right? And you can't say, well, okay, well, that's not the only alternative. All right, well, the third alternative I just talked to you about, which is, well, we should keep applying economic power until we get a better deal. This is the deal. But I'd add again, it's a real reflection of our political culture here that we really don't like this approach, right? Even after all the clear-cut cases we have of our last use of military power, we really don't like the fact that the president has invested a lot of political resources to try this, right? And that goes back to my slide that says, the fault is not in our stars, it's in ourselves, right?
Looking at Crimea and eastern Ukraine, does not Putin and Russia demonstrate the political use of military power successfully?
No, I'm just the phrasing of political use of military power. Okay, success. Yes. No, yeah. So us and the Russians have learned very different lessons from the past 15 years. Russia is very weak when it comes to the other instruments of national power, right? Its soft power, its diplomacy is quite clever and effective at times, but by and large, it has very little soft power, and the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, doesn't believe in it at all. It's not a thing that he's remotely interested in using. Russia's economic power, as we know, is incredibly weak, right? Information, not much better. Western media almost dominates the entire world. Information across the information spectrum. But Russia's military power, it has leveraged and it is used fairly effectively to achieve desired political ends. First, in the Second War in Chechnya. Next, in the application of military power in Georgia, which, while in how the operation was done, went very poorly and led to a very, very drastic change in the Russian military called the period of modernization military reform between 2008 and now. That's why that slide of Russian troops and what they look like, if I had my clicker. Oh, my clicker's not attached to anything, okay. So that's gone. But that's why they look so different now. But their takeaway is that they have been able to use military power to achieve political ends. And obviously, if I was in their shoes in Moscow and I was faced with a crisis scenario that required me to make decisions within a very short time span, what I would reach for is the most effective implement of national power I have that I have consistently used and has delivered me results. And that is what Crimea was. Possibly one of the best, most effective, and most efficient uses of military power we have seen in many years. However, Crimea also taught them the wrong lessons, and when they tried to apply what happened in Crimea to eastern Ukraine, they quickly fell into precisely what we fell into in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is the surest way to test whether your assumptions about the nature of a country, its people, its society, and its polity are true is to invade it. And that allows you to have a much closer look as to how much what you know about that country really matches up with the reality. And Russia had a great deal of assumptions about Ukraine. They're historical assumptions, but also some assumptions based on how easy and quick Crimea went. So easy. I mean, it's essentially a bank heist, right? Masked men show up, take your peninsula, and leave in less than 30 days, and not a single person is killed, right? They just, there's a bank heist. They ran off with it. And then Russia found out that that's wrong, and it's adapting on the ground, and it's dribbling in, and it's gone from being a very good, an attempt at a covert operation to the use of irregular force and a hybrid power to limited conventional war in Europe, right, which is what it is. And a large-scale train and equip mission, which Russia's conducting right now in eastern Ukraine, to essentially set up a smaller version of its army amongst the separatists, backed by its forces, right? So they're kind of doing, on a much shorter time span, the things that we've been doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also learning, those same lessons, which is you start an operation, your assumptions get proven wrong, and you have to adapt and adapt. And what happens is that by adapt, I mean you have to keep investing more military power, more money, more political power. The stakes go up and the costs go up, right, at each iteration of that process. So have they successfully used military power to achieve desired political ends? Yes, they have. My other two thoughts on that is they have to because they don't have anything else to use. I mean, you only have one arm, so I hope you use it well. Two, that is a snapshot, and that is the historical record of the last 15 years, which does look a lot better than ours. However, as I see in every single one of these financial advertisements go across TV, past performance is no predictor of future results. So we will see. Right now, what's going on in Ukraine, the matter is very much in question as to whether or not 5 years from now, if I come back here again, I will have a slide with Eastern Ukraine on showing that as a decisive use of military power or an exceptional repeat of America's mistakes.
So following up on that, what do you see Putin's motives are, not just in Ukraine, but long range?
Well, okay. First of all, I never want to have a conversation about Vladimir Putin, and one thing people really have to understand that it's not Vladimir Putin's Russia, it's Russia's Vladimir Putin. It's a country of 145 million people. Whenever we talk about in DC, we often have these sort of Russian narrators, and the picture they paint us of Russia is that Russia's a really big country with a population of one guy. His name's Vladimir Putin, and he lives in Moscow. And all that matters is kind of trying to get into his head and what he's going to do. And it's not. He's not an absolute dictator. He actually doesn't do things that they doesn't have implicit or explicit public support for across the full crosscut of both elites and the entire Russian public. And Vladimir Putin is not making Russia pursue a course of action that Russia would not want to take. He's not convincing the public to undertake something that the public would not want to do. He is channeling them. This is the Vladimir Putin that they love. He is not a unique leader for Russia in Russia's history. He is a quintessentially typical leader for Russia across Russian history, all right? And he is the leader, the type of leader that Russians really like. So make no mistake, this is not a problem with Vladimir Putin. This is a problem with 145 million people in Russia, all right? And with respect to what is his intent, because I think it's a very important point to get that out, because as soon as you say Vladimir Putin, you're having the wrong conversation. Your conversation is, what is Putin thinking? What's he going to do? What's going on in his head? And that degenerates the entire field of Russia analysis into some kind of pseudo-psychoanalysis of Vladimir Putin, which is not what I have a degree in. So I think that Vladimir Putin's already achieved the bulk of his objectives in Ukraine. One, to annex Crimea, which of course he did. And Crimea was an initial response, and it was a partial response because they weren't sure how that operation would go. So they had many points of disengagement. And it turned out for them that it would be not only something that would be very easy to take, but something that their public would greatly support. And with respect to the rest of Ukraine, there is no grand strategy to taking Crimea from Ukraine, by the way. Russians see this as just and as the right thing to do, and then very, very logical to take. Because the greatest strategic piece of geography in the Black Sea is Crimea. It allows you to control the whole Black Sea. Does this thing work again? Oh, yes. Look at Crimea right here. Look at the big circle that it covers the whole Black Sea from. That's it. That's the only important piece of real estate. And it was the easiest one to take, and it was the one where you were sure the population there would support them, and the one where Russia had military assets. So it was the lowest hanging fruit and the #1 primary objective. And when those two come together, that's a gimme decision. That's what you do. When your strategic objective is also the easiest objective to achieve militarily. But with the rest of Ukraine, the point of Russia's point is to create essentially a strategic grappling hook in Ukraine with this conflict, one, which they've done. And that will determine Ukraine's geopolitical orientation in the long term in the future, which it will. And second is to prevent a Western economic assistance and political reform mission from succeeding in Ukraine. And the way this question is structured is, our position is we've made a political commitment to the people of Ukraine. We will not allow Ukraine to fail. And Russia's view is that that's fine. Their position is that they will not allow Ukraine to succeed. The problem is that their half of that bargain is a lot easier to accomplish and takes a lot less resources. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe after France, and has 42 million people. So as you see how easy it is to make a commitment for Greece not to fail, with 11 million people, when I say I am making a commitment to a country of 42 million people that is also bankrupt, that you will not fail. You know, it's a very difficult proposition. The Russians understand this. So their goal is for us to get tired. I was just in Ukraine in May, east and west. And for us to develop fatigue. Ukraine's a country with a great many structural problems, economy, corruption. It is the quintessential oligarchy. Russia's not. I mean, Ukraine is the quintessential oligarchy in Europe, and it still remains so today, even after the revolution. So their view is we'll get tired, we'll develop fatigue, and slowly but surely, the current class of elites that are in Ukraine are already largely old, unreformed elites. They will change their tune, and they will return to dealing with Russia as they have in the past. So that's Russia's objective. It's pretty simple. Establish strategic hooks in Ukraine so that no matter what happens, Ukraine will not get into NATO, and probably will not enter EU, and they've accomplished that. So the view, from what I understand, in NATO is that Ukraine is never going into NATO. And the view of the EU is that at the earliest 10 years to never, or whatever between 10 years and never is. So they've already achieved that, okay? And Ukrainians are slowly waking up to this reality. They have very unrealistic expectations. But yeah, but the long-term objective is precisely that. Have the West develop fatigue with Ukraine. Our part of the job, sort of what we're trying to achieve in Ukraine, is way harder than what the Russians are trying to achieve in Ukraine. And eventually, the elites in Ukraine will return to dealing with Russia and balancing with them. And I would say that that is an equal probability event to what we think might happen, right? Which is Ukraine will conduct these drastic political economic reforms. It'll work out. And we will prove to have the strategic patience, which we are so known for in the United States, to see through a country that will require a large investment of political and economic resources over the span of many years. Next question.
Switching to another power, rival, antagonist, China. Chuck Hagel said that if a conflict breaks out between China and Japan, America will have to come to the aid of Japan militarily. Is that a red line we're likely to do, and what are the chances of really serious conflict between the countries?
Okay. Yeah, we have an alliance with Japan, the defense pact, where we have to come to their defense. So, yep, that's what it says. Yeah. Oh, you can't hear me. Can you hear me now? All right, sorry. So the first part is yes, we have a defense pact with Japan and we have to come to their aid. Period. That's it. That's all there is to that. Not vague, it's not optional. That's it. That's one of our top allies in the world as we know it. It's one of the top economies in the world. It's one of the top military powers outside of China in the Asia-Pacific region. And it's one of our longest allies and partners since World War II. And as sure as I am here, we will see that commitment through. That's one. And the Chinese understand that. Taiwan might be a little bit more debatable, but Japan is absolutely not. Second, the likelihood of them coming into conflict I think it's a serious prospect. I think it's a very serious prospect, and I'll tell you why. China's obviously using its military power coercively and is being fairly aggressive in its region, right? And it's expanding both its power and influence, which is kind of a glib way to put it. But what it really is doing is it's challenging its allies. And it will increasingly put the question in doubt into its allies' mind to what extent the United States is committed to their defense and how real is that insurance policy. And their objective, of course, is to reassure them and to deter China, but most importantly, to make sure that they do not begin hedging their bets, okay? Because as China's power and military capability continues to grow, countries will only naturally begin to hedge their bets. Japan is the only other country that could become a regional military power and has now chosen to do so. And it has changed its constitution to allow the use of its military forces. Japan's military is called the Self-Defense Forces, and they are no longer the Self-Defense Forces as of this year. That piece of tech I showed you is a Japanese newly launched helicopter carrier. We all know what this is. This is the likely beginning of a carrier fleet in Japan, all right? And on the one hand, and this is to understand what the real pluses and minuses are, the benefits and the risks, our allies empowering themselves of what we're going to need. We don't have the power to deter and reassure everybody around the world. So understand the insurance business aspect of this policy. We've given out insurance policies to everybody in Europe against Russia, everybody in the Asia-Pacific region against China, and all the guys in the Middle East against Iran. And the concept of an insurance business is that it works unless everybody calls those in at the same time, okay? The way this business model works is that only a couple of these insurance policies will be called in at any given time. And last year, they were all called in, right? So the president and vice president had to cross in midair, with one flying to reassure our allies in Asia Pacific, another one flying to reassure our Eastern European allies, right, against Russia. And then somebody else had to go down to Israel and Saudi Arabia, right? So, and this is the future. So our allies have to empower themselves. The only drawback of that is Japan can be a regional power that other countries in the Asia-Pacific region can coalesce around, okay? Meaning they present an alternative. And they have the money. And they have the technology, obviously, our technology that we co-develop with them. And they have the ability to do it. The problem is that Japan coming back, Chinese are incredibly apprehensive about Japan and have not forgotten or forgiven what's happened in World War II. And many in China simply do not, because of the history, do not see Japan as a normative power, as a normative country, which to us may seem crazy, I think, here, because we've only known them as allies for, since World War II. But just as, if you ask Poland what it thinks about Russia, or, Latvia or Lithuania, you will hear things that don't make a lot of sense, but are understandable based on history. And the same thing in China and Japan. So the big plus is they empower themselves, and we get into a scenario where Japan is able to defend itself, and we're going to come help. And that makes sense. The drawback is once countries empower themselves, they get these things called interests. And once they get actual military power, and you say, wow, this is really great, you guys are investing in the ability to defend yourselves, they then start to pursue their own objectives with the application of military power, and not necessarily to your liking. Right? So you asked me earlier about Turkey. And so what happens is then you get into a scenario where you have to be really careful about discouraging reckless driving by your allies. And that's probably what we're going to manage in the future between Japan and China, as Japan increasingly presents some sort of alternative in the Asia-Pacific region to China and has to heavily invest in its military power. The hostilities and the overall atmosphere between China and Japan is going to get hotter and hotter and hotter. And we're going to have to manage that. And I wonder to what extent those two countries can manage that relationship responsibly, because we all know the history of China and Japan, right?
How does China and Russia view our military power and our willingness to use it?
I think that they absolutely fear it. It is the most potent force in the world by a very, very wide margin. But they definitely don't respect it, and they have plenty of reasons not to respect it. We've given the use cases of its application, at least in recent years. Right? So if you walked away from the 1991 Gulf War, you would say this is an amazing military capability that is able to decisively intervene in a country, destroy its military, and achieve its political objectives, right? And that might be the depiction of U.S. power in the 90s. And if you walk away from this decade of war, you basically have the perspective of it's an incredibly awesome and powerful military force that can adapt to almost any challenge, and is likely the most experienced military that you have today around the world. Maybe you could take the challenge with Israel's, but as I showed that picture, it's the #1 muscle we exercise consistently. But we have not applied it thoughtfully, we have not applied it effectively, and we have not applied it in a way that achieves what were our objectives and anything positive for our allies. So they see it as kind of reckless. So what happens is you get in a place where these two countries fear the United States very much, okay? But they don't respect how we use our military power the way they used to. And I think what's happening in Ukraine with Russia is a very, very clear example of that. I think very, very clearly you feel from Russia the lack of respect for the United States as an effective force. That's, deep down inside, I feel, if I was to do like a bit of narration, I feel that's where the challenge comes from. Right? That they just simply do not respect us as any longer an effective or competent force in the world. Not that they don't fear us. They're perfectly aware how easily we could crush them any given day of the week. That's not it. They just don't respect us anymore. With China, I think that the big military challenge is that our military, going back to, I don't know, the battles of Greeks against the Persians, has always been based on leveraging technology, training, and doctrine, to achieve decisive success against much more numerically superior forces, right? And that's where we are today. The problem for us is that this is the setup we've had with China, meaning, in any military contingency with China, they will have the numbers and we will have the quality, the technological edge, the tactics, and the doctrine. Well, our technological edge continues to diminish. And their qualitative edge, basically the qualitative characteristics of what they bring to the table continues to rise. And so China drastically, and both Russia, are invested in only one thing, which is don't fight the United States, create a military scenario where the United States can only enter the entire theater of operation at great cost and great risk. And the United States, based on its experience in conflict, has a perception that basically a very low risk tolerance. Just haven't taken a lot of casualties in all these conflicts, very low risk tolerance. We think that we're going to be able to engage in the use of force with very, very small consequences for our troops. And their presentation is, their view is present a lot of risk. That's it, keep the United States out of the area. And that's what they're both invested in. That's what these, that's what this is all about.
You talked about our shadow war as being one of the most effective sides of our military strategy. But you didn't, you didn't mention.
Yeah, I didn't mention that. What did I mention?
You didn't list any specific, besides obviously the killing of bin Laden, any specific instances to back up that statement.
Right, so, okay, fair enough. I think I didn't mention the killing of bin Laden. So what the shadow war has allowed us to do is it allowed us to take the key international terrorist organizations that were primarily interested in attacking the United States, like Al-Qaeda, others that are now around Syria, and to sufficiently suppress and degrade them to the point that they could not conduct any effective large-scale attack against the United States. And that while they were able in the early years to conduct terrorist attacks against our European allies in reprisal, they are now down to trying to effectively leverage information power to turn and radicalize particular individuals in the United States to conducting these very small-scale attacks. But of course, we understand the difference between shooting 4 Marines and 9/11, right? So let's be serious about how far we've come. And the shadow war is essentially how we were able to do it. It turned, being number 3, number 4 in Al-Qaeda into a temporary position. No need for benefits. You won't be there very long. Now, some of you may say, well, it hasn't destroyed Al-Qaeda. Well, that's not the point. I don't know if it's possible to destroy Al-Qaeda, and I'm sure as soon as you destroy Al-Qaeda, all the people that weren't Al-Qaeda will go join ISIS or al-Nusra, okay? It is often characterized as a multi-headed hydra. The question is, have we suppressed this organization and disrupted them and any other would-be organizations to the point that they do not pose an existential threat? Well, they never pose an existential threat to the United States, but they could severely affect how we live, right? Remember our reaction to 9/11. The economic damage of that attack. If you think about the low input that Al-Qaeda put into 9/11 versus the outputs of that attack in the United States, how little money and effort it took for them to create that degree of social, political, and economic damage, right? You say, well, they don't pose an existential threat. Well, I think that's a very simple analysis. So we've been able to sufficiently degrade and suppress them. And that's through the course of an endless drone campaign over Pakistan, which had always been conducted by and large, for what I remember clearly, the acquiescence of the Pakistani government, and over Yemen, and in Somalia, and Nigeria, and all around the world. And what essentially we have is we have drastically ramped up special forces, integrated them into our regular military units, which they weren't before this decade of war, and have really leveraged technology, special forces. And this campaign is run out of JSOC, Joint Special Forces Operation Command, right? Sorry, I think when I do this, you lose the mic, right? It's hard to give you clear-cut examples because there are so many of them, right? But as you understand, every day you pick up the news and you find out this guy might have been hit and killed in Yemen, something happened to al-Shabaab over here, something happened in northern Pakistan. You understand that this is a long, ongoing, and running effort, all right? And it essentially keeps your boots permanently on the neck of the key terrorist organizations that are out behind the United States, right? And there are organizations in Syria, it's not ISIS, that's primarily interested in attacking the United States, but there are others up there that are very interested in the United States and less interested in conquering Iraq, right? That's what the shadow war is about. And as I told somebody earlier, the difference between 01 and 2015 is 01, you can think of this little simple metal push mower, okay? The shadow war today is basically this giant John Deere ride-along mower, where it's a very well-developed, established system. It's well integrated, works with our allies. But it requires us to have lots of bases and continued presence in all these parts of the world, right? Yeah? It's like I said, it's not like in the movies where special forces guys appear out of nowhere and they show up in Pakistan. And no, you don't do this without permanent basing in the region. You don't do this without force protection around that base. To deploy special forces, it's a joke because light infantry always carries the heaviest backpack. So to deploy special forces, you need firepower support for them. You need search and rescue for them, too, for what happens when they get into trouble, okay? You need intelligence assets for them on the ground, okay? You need backup forces to come support them and pull them out of a fight, right? You need evac medical, and all these assets have to come from somewhere. Where are they going to come from? They don't, teleport in from the continental United States, right? So obviously, they're going to come from a base in Afghanistan or a base in one of the Central Asian countries. They're obviously going to come from a special forces unit that's operating, in Yemen or, in Somalia, et cetera, et cetera. So it requires constant presence. And this creates a lot of, this is not without its problems. But I think it's the most successful application of military power. And it's the only thing, going back to 2001, that we got right when we said we could very efficiently combine the information age and information-driven military and technology and leverage these assets to, achieve a political objective. And the political objective is not, hey, we're going to solve the contextual sources of terrorism across all of Africa, Middle East, and Central Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia with this. The objective is, how do we make it so that these key international terrorist networks are not in a position to organize a serious attack in the United States again? And we've done that.
The Obama foreign policy, you mentioned very specifically, that Libya was a great mistake, and that's a burden for Hillary Clinton. But overall, how do you assess Obama's foreign policy?
Right. Well, I think the history of Libya is not Hillary Clinton's mistake. It's President Obama's mistake. Echo? I think President Obama really envisioned that he was going to have a cabinet of rivals, and he was going to have very serious people in there, like Bob Gates and Hillary Clinton. But what I see as problematic is probably one of the more distinct cases where that came into play, that you had a Secretary of State and a Secretary of Defense with very differing views on how the United States should proceed, whether we should initiate a conflict in military force in Libya or not. That process spit out a really bad result, right? This was division and administration of how they wanted, the kind of process they wanted to have for making these key national security decisions, and the one clear-cut case we definitely see of it came up with a bad result, and that bad result is called the Libyan intervention of 2011. What do you think about Obama's foreign policy? I think it effectively integrates the lessons of the mistakes from the Bush administration and the decade of war, and also the positive lessons of what we learned adapting in the latter years of the Bush administration as well. It's a very tough question to answer, but I don't think the president obviously gave his foreign policy and his vision a full hearing when he said that we don't do stupid. Right? I don't think that was a very good summary of his foreign policy. And he said that, just like saying we're not going to chase every rabbit down the hole in the Middle East is not a very good summary of our foreign policy. Here's kind of my view. The United States has no grand proactive strategy or foreign policy in the world. As I was telling somebody earlier, probably the last time we had one that was very clear was the containment strategy against the Soviet Union after World War II, which was a proactive strategy, a vision for the world that laid out what we're going to go out and do to deal with the Soviet Union, right? And we haven't had to come up with one after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the post-Cold War era, right? Like I said, the end of history, democracy, liberalism, promotion was where it was at. Now I think the Obama foreign policy is summarized this way. One, damage control. Damage control, Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Middle East. Two, try to achieve a strategic reorientation to the Asia-Pacific theater, which was where we, in this decade, thought sort of the economic and political future of the world was going, right? I don't know if that's so certain with China anymore, but there was definitely an image of China here in the United States, and what China would look like 20 years from now that I think in many ways resembled how we saw Japan in the 1980s, right? We saw the rise of Japan in the 1980s, and if you looked in the 1980s, we said, okay, what will Japan look like 20 years from now? In 2000s, we kind of said this. And then after the 1980s, at the beginning of the 90s, what happened was this. Right, so the foreign policy of Obama is one, damage control in the Middle East. Try to suppress the spread of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, whatnot, but with the minimum amount of investment possible. Extraction of U.S. military entanglement in Iraq and Afghanistan. Essentially close out the business that we began 15 years ago. Close each of these out. And try to strategically reorient the United States to the Asia-Pacific region. And I think a lot of that involves serious investment in reassurance and deterrence with our allies. I think the black swan event of the last year and a half was definitely Ukraine. You know, of all the conflicts that was not supposed to happen and all the things that shouldn't have happened, Ukraine is definitely at the top of that list. And nobody saw a war returning to the central axis of how we kind of see the world. And the central axis is Europe. A conventional war in the European theater in the year 2014 would have been unthinkable. If somebody told you that was a prospect in 2012, they probably wouldn't have believed it. So other than that, I mean, you know the rest, right? The focus on the legacy. We need to have this deal with Iran. We need to get TTP, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you know the quintessential pieces of foreign policy that the Obama administration is trying to tie up, and I don't want to run through them. But yeah, if I think that there's a clear vision, I don't really see one. I see it basically as damage control, not getting the United States entangled in any of the sort of things that the Bush administration got entangled in, and trying to be the president that extracts American troops from both Iraq and Afghanistan. And tries to reorient the United States to the Asia Pacific. And the big problem with that is, it's always like, just as I thought I got out, they pulled me back in. It's like this Godfather 3 scenario, where the Middle East keeps getting a vote, and the Middle East vote is the United States can't leave. We just can't leave. Right? So that's the real challenge, is how do we focus on dealing with China and the Asia Pacific theater when the Middle East won't let us leave? And now we actually have to invest time and resources in Europe again.
I think this is probably our last question. The WikiLeaks and Snowden disclosures, how serious were they to national security and national prestige?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, WikiLeaks, WikiLeaks were pretty damaging, but I think more to our allies than to us, to be frank. So WikiLeaks revealed a great deal of our cooperation with our allies, and they were very damaging to a number of governments, especially all our, autocratic allies and like Saudi Arabia. So WikiLeaks, for example, had revealed in Pakistan and made clear that while the Pakistani government had always said, publicly, officially complained against U.S. drone strikes, it showed what everybody who has common sense knew, that U.S. drone strikes were done with the full permission and cooperation of the Pakistani government, right? And that made the Pakistani military have a lot of problems, because this is the kind of information that's only known at the top, right? And then once it becomes revealed and everybody else in your military and in your institutions reads it, they realize that their leaders have been lying to them. And that's pretty damaging. So, and it revealed a great deal about our cooperation with Saudi Arabia, revealed a great deal about counterterrorism cooperation between us and Eastern European countries during the nastier parts of the shadow war in the early years. So it was more damaging for them, I think, than for us. But Snowden was catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic, to the national security establishment and intelligence community. Just really devastating. However, what was the question again? How bad is it?
How serious is the
impact? Very serious, very serious. I think the impact from Edward Snowden is definitely, this was the worst intelligence calamity for the United States since we first began to have anything resembling an intelligence community here. Then the consequences of it, will continue to unfold. But on the other hand, I will say this. I have very kind of mixed, countervailing views on this, mixed feelings about it, where I think on the one, it was very devastating and it shouldn't have happened. But I wonder if we could have had the very important debate and discussion that we needed to have in the United States without Edward Snowden prompting it. So at the beginning of this war on terror, this shadow war, in the beginning of these operations in Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11, all right, we really made a set of choices and compromises about where that balance of security and freedom and transparency and right to privacy are. And those choices were increasingly made at the elite level. And they were, by and large, in my mind, driven by fear and the prospect of another attack and the perception that security was mission one, right? After 9/11, this was mission number one for people who are in charge of their country, and that this is the primary responsibility of the government. But over many years, as those apparatuses became more and more entrenched and more developed and more effective, those were less systems and, in my view, more self-licking ice cream cones, okay? Meaning the legitimacy chain, okay, of why we're doing what we're doing, okay? How legitimate is that process? How well does that fit with our values and our Constitution? Became increasingly, in my view, something that was on paper, but not really subject to the democratic process and the transparent process. And I think that as a country, you can only do that for so long. And that's a conversation we should have had before Edward Snowden did this. And Edward Snowden, by doing this, prompted this. It was disastrous for the intel community. But it was very important for us to reassess this. And I don't know if we would have done it if he hadn't made these disclosures. I really don't. And I don't believe, I'm not one of those people that had these great fears that NSA was just spending all their time abusing their power and this, that, and other. They don't, know a lot of people in the intelligence community. If you look at that workload, nobody has time to listen to read your Facebook, okay? They don't. We have bad news. And nothing anybody in this country writes on Facebook or in their emails is that interesting to anybody in NSA. It's an absurdly individually vain perspective that anybody in the intelligence community would spend 30 seconds of their time reading your Facebook and your email. As somebody who's worked in government, if I had 30 seconds of free time, I would be on my Facebook and my email, right? Wasting it. I sure as heck wouldn't go to read somebody else's, right? But no, I do think it was really bad, but also really good. Also really good. I fundamentally think that it was important to reassess and to reconnect this chain of legitimacy of what, this trade-off that elites had made. It cannot continue for this long a time without it being a choice that society collectively makes, right? And we have to have that discussion again to actually decide what we as a country, as a people, how we want to balance the security versus the freedoms and the rights and protections.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you next week. Thanks for coming.